Without further ado, I'm delighted to welcome our third speaker this morning, Professor Rob Iliffe from this very university, and he's going to talk to us about Newton and people he didn't like.
I will talk about Hooke and Leibniz and try and come to terms with some ways of thinking about why Newton had problems with these individuals above others. I mean, there's a third person with whom he had problems, John Flamsteed, but that's not quite at the same level, I think, of the existential problems that Hooke and Leibniz played in his life. So just some background to Newton. He was, depending on which part of the world you're in, he was born on the 25th of December, 1642. So that's in England. He's born in the same year that Galileo died. Paradoxically, in the place where Galileo died, Newton died on the 4th of January, 1643. Just a few months after the Civil War began in England, Newton's father died in October 1642. We don't know very much about that. And his mother remarried when he was very young, producing 3 half-siblings for the young Isaac. We know that Newton spent a lot of his time. We have good evidence about what Newton did as a young man from Newton and, in fact, from other people. We know that he went into local fields and did what's called simpling, looking for medicinal plants. He was interested in astronomy. He was interested in building dolls' houses, kites, clocks, sundials, and so on and so forth, playing philosophically, as the antiquarian and friend of Newton, William Stukeley, put it in the 1720s. Although he had other distractions and, according to Newton himself, didn't do very well at school, occasionally he always had the ability to pull himself back and outpace his colleagues. And he went to Trinity College in 1661 in the summer, just after the restoration of Charles II. And Trinity College moved from and I think this does matter for Newton, whether it matters for this story is probably for you to decide, but Trinity College went from a very Puritan establishment back to a very conservative, reactionary Church of England establishment. And these, I think, clearly have influences on Newton, who is a devout, godly boy. This is a picture of Woolsthorpe Manor in Lincolnshire, near Grantham, from the first decade of the 19th century, with a barn stuck on the side. And this is where Newton grew up. He grew up in a place where he had a lot of servants. He's not a poor boy made good. He comes from a very wealthy family. His mother was one of the wealthiest people in that part of England. But nevertheless, Newton has this shtick, or this business of independence that marks him out through his life. This is from a book that he read, The Mysteries of Art and Nature by Jonathan Bate, 1656. We know that he built this clepsydra, a water clock, and this was the source of his ingenuity when he was a boy. Newton at Cambridge studied the basic curriculum, not a billion miles away from the one that Andy discussed, Aristotle and to a lesser extent Plato, until early 1664, when we know, because it's lavishly documented in materials that are at Cambridge University Library, he started to read the latest works in mathematics, particularly by John Wallis, and others, and he read the latest works in natural philosophy, the works of people who were at the newly founded Royal Society, particularly Robert Boyle and, as we shall see, Robert Hooke, and he studied these things in an ultra-critical way. He immersed himself in these works, he imbibed the doctrines, and he wrote against them, and devised experimental programs to test his own new ways of thinking. And there isn't really anyone who's doing this kind of thing. I mean, he could have been doing it and not been doing brilliant work, but he did it, and he did pioneering brilliant work in 3 separate fields: mechanics, mathematics, and optics. We know that in 1665 to 6, he found what later became called the fundamental theorems or algorithms of calculus, differential and integral calculus, the binomial theorem. He did stupendous work, I think, in mechanics, and he discovered the heterogeneity of white light, which is that primary white light that comes from the sun is composed of more basic primary colored rays. And that overturned a theory that had been held by virtually everybody for 2,000 years, which is that colors are produced when white light is modified in its passage to another medium. Newton, as you will have guessed, argued that when white light, for example, hits a prism, the colors into which it will be broken down going through a prism are already constitutive of the white light before it hits the prism. For his work in optics and predominantly mathematics, Newton was made the second Lucasian professor of mathematics in September 1669. This is the famous attempt by Newton. This tells you what Newton is like. This is the calculation to 55 decimal places of the area under a hyperbola. This is the only image of the crucial experiment, with light coming in from the right, hitting a lens, then being put into a prism, and then going through a board on the left, and an individual primary ray being separated, and then that being further refracted through a prism on the other side of the board. And what Newton wants to say is that the defining characteristic of a ray of light is its index of refraction, or what he calls its degree of refrangibility. And that's an extraordinary thing to say. I mean, he will move as a mathematicist, natural philosopher, to say that the defining characteristic of a ray of light is not that it is composed of atoms that spin or travel at a certain speed, although he does believe that in private. But in public, he will say it is its index of refraction that marks its obstinate capacity to retain its degree of refrangibility through successive refractions that is the characteristic of a primary coloured ray. The first paper Newton published was in February 1672. It received serious attention, criticism from Christian Huygens and Robert Hooke. Hooke in particular was upset by a throwaway line Newton had given in the paper, saying that nobody in their right mind could doubt that light was particulate, which he shouldn't have said, and he regretted doing that. But the key point of the paper is to put forward a mathematicist view of what a ray of light is. As it were, like most mathematicists or mathematicians who go into natural philosophy, the price of the benefit of mathematizing natural philosophy is that you hollow it out. You are no longer able to talk about what the stuff of light is, because you are moving towards defining light or anything else mathematically. Hooke made it known that he thought that Newton's work was merely a hypothesis, a theory, and Newton took umbrage at this. He became very angry, and in a number of letters he wrote in 1672, 73, he argued that his work was more than a hypothesis. It was mathematically absolutely certain. This is what this guy's like. What he's done is certain. It doesn't have the characteristic of something that is less than that degree of mathematical certainty. It's certainly not an hypothesis, as he says. Whereas Robert Hooke's stuff is a hypothesis. Robert Hooke's defense of a wave theory of light for Newton is the defense of something that cannot be made absolutely certain, and therefore Hooke should not defend it or be committed to it in the same way that Newton is committed to his own ideas. And this exchange with Hooke marked out Newton's dislike or hatred for the public sphere, I think, for the rest of his career. Newton will always think that the best way to do science is to do it in private, before a group of like-minded, smart people who agree with everything he says. And that's conversely, the public sphere is a place for where the vulgar misunderstand that which they have no hope of comprehending. That's Christian Huygens. That is relevant. This book appeared in January 1665 from Robert Hooke, and it's a book that Newton devoured very quickly. In the mid-1670s, Newton had withdrawn from the public sphere. He'd been used by the editor of the Philosophical Transactions, Henry Oldenburg, as a way of filling up the space of the Transactions with debates about Newton's theory. And Newton retreated back to Cambridge sort of physically and mentally and devoted himself to alchemy and theology. But like Al Pacino in Godfather 3, he kept on being pulled back in to debates about the nature of light, because people care about it. And at the end of 1675, he unwisely gave a talk which he called the Hypothesis on Light and Colours. He provided a paper, anyway, that was read out to the Royal Society. It's an extraordinary insight into his own personal natural philosophy. It's a rich account of how music and light and colour and everything else are all kind of connected in some extraordinary way. Hooke heard this and accused Newton of plagiarising from micrographia. And with Christopher Wren and others, he started a new rival group right at the end of 1675 to degrade the quality of the Royal Society. And this is a deliberate attempt by Robert Hooke to destroy the Royal Society by creating a new society. And the very first thing they discuss in their first meeting is how Newton has plagiarized from micrographia. So Newton gets to hear about this, and he took umbrage, that is to say he went ballistic, being accused of being a plagiarist. And there's some wonderful material in his private writings about how it's Hooke himself who is a plagiarist from Descartes. And this is where you really see Newton being brilliant, I think, is where he gets angry. I mean, people shouldn't make him angry, like the Incredible Hulk, because when he gets angry, people wouldn't like him. And he destroys Hooke over the next few years. But he does write this famous letter in early February 1676, where he says, in the wake of that, if I have seen further than you, and I have, it's because I'm standing on the shoulders of giants. And he never forgot what Hooke said. Right to the end of his life, he remembered that slight by Hooke. The third and greatest contest between Newton and Hooke concerned the allocation of credit for key doctrines of the Principia, which was published in the summer of 1687. In a series of brilliant letters written in 1679-80, Hooke, who was now Secretary of the Royal Society, had tried to drag Newton back into discussions about natural philosophy. And he'd asked Newton what Newton thought about producing an elliptical orbit by compounding inertial motion with centrally attracting forces in planetary objects. And Newton responded. Again, it's a long story, but essentially he took on board a lot of what Robert Hooke said, that the general approach that Hooke provided for him is found in the Principia. It provides the basis for Newton's analysis in Principia Mathematica, although, of course, Newton goes way beyond anything Hooke could possibly have done or imagined. When it was known in 1686 that this transformational book was forthcoming, Hooke asked people to tell Newton that he expected some credit for the core doctrines in his book. And Newton told him, again, remotely, to go forth and multiply. And again, there's some wonderful discussions that we know took place in coffee houses in 1686, where Hooke said, essentially, he'd had this proof that Newton that was going to give in the Principia, but Hooke had kept it to himself, knowing how important it was. And his friends broke with Hooke, saying, if it had been that important to you, you should have published it. And it's a very interesting debate where Hooke breaks from people he'd been close to for over 3 decades. Newton understood in this action that Hooke was turning philosophy into a law court, and I think that's very important for Newton. Newton hates the idea that natural philosophy is simply about disputing. He hates the idea that natural philosophy is about metaphysics. He hates the idea that natural philosophy is about the value that's given to something by people who read books and act as sort of witnesses and warrantors for what the book describes. For Newton, what you put forward as a natural philosopher is intrinsically convincing, or it isn't. If it's attached to mathematics, like his work in Light, or if it's attached to mathematics, if it has a mathematical basis, as in Principia Mathematica, with the law of universal gravitation, then you don't need thousands or tens of thousands of unworthy people to say that they warrant it or believe it's true. It simply is true. It helps if you've got experts, the 2 or 3 other people in the world who understand the Principia. It helps if they say it's kosher, but you don't need them. And so Newton's problem, I think, is the introduction of legalistic behavior and discourse into the realm of natural philosophy. And he complains in a wonderful phrase about Robert Hooke turning philosophy, that is science, into a litigious lady. And it's only the great diplomatic work of Edmund Halley that pulls Newton back in to finishing the Principia. When the Principia was published, Newton very quickly became a star. He was the first scientific celebrity. People came to see him. They came from Italy, they came from Russia to see Newton. He became an MP in the Glorious Revolution of 1689. This is a picture from 1689. It's the earliest one we have, by Godfrey Kneller. Throughout the 1690s, he became a government official. He was Warden of the Mint, then Master of the Mint from 1696. He became President of the Royal Society in 1703, and he was knighted for his services to government in 1705. The Queen Anne took a break from horse racing at Newmarket to come down and tap him on the shoulder, and then went back to the horse racing. I did mean to try and find out what the races were that day, but I never got around to it. This is also Kneller now. This is 11 years later in 1702, just as Newton is becoming a majorly powerful figure in natural philosophy and in the English, soon-to-be British government. And then we have Leibniz. Leibniz, it's hard to describe Leibniz's brilliance, least as great as Newton. Extraordinary breadth that Leibniz has. He's a diplomat, he's a mathematician, he's a librarian. His key job is as a librarian, or at least it's supposed to be, a librarian writing the history of the House of Brunswick. But it's his mathematical brilliance, produced really while working with Christian Huygens in Paris in the mid-1670s, that sees him develop what we now take to be the modern notation of calculus in 1675-6, and resulted in him publishing the first articulation of calculus in 1684 and 1686. It's those publications that forced Newton to publish the famous fluxions lemma, which is just inserted in at the last moment into the Principia Mathematica. It's the only part of the Principia where you see Newton's expertise in calculus. As time went on, Newton had lackeys, a number of people whom he did nothing to control, who went from saying that Newton had some entitlement to the claim of the inventor of calculus, to saying that Leibniz's calculus was inferior, and also that Leibniz was a plagiarist, having somehow seen Newton's private writings on mathematics, which Newton had, of course, done these things in 65-66, but because of his distaste for the public sphere, he had not released them to more than a handful of people. As Leibniz became more interested in, and Leibniz is a brilliant, accomplished metaphysician, as Leibniz became more interested in Newton's science, he became more worried by what he saw. And in a way that, again, there's been much pen, much ink has been spilled over writing about this. But from 1710, 1711, Leibniz, who was a member of the Royal Society, with Newton as president, Leibniz demanded of the Royal Society that the Royal Society not back those people who had said that he was a plagiarist. And of course, under the heading of Newton, the Royal Society refused to do that. Newton refused to rein in his followers. As Leibniz looked more closely at Newton's doctrines, he saw something terrible. He saw something diabolic. Newton's notion of absolute space was absurd. His notion of a sensorium, which is to say that God had a peculiar relationship with his creation, as if Leibniz said it, Newton had said it was the organ of God's sensing, which is a heresy in any branch of Christian philosophy. The more he looked at what Newton had done, the more disgusted he became. When he looked at universal gravitation, he saw something completely absurd. You know, the idea that two objects on either side of an infinite space could influence each other in real time was absurd. No one, not even the medievals, had ventured to claim something so stupid, dangerous, and absurd. And Leibniz is one of a number of top people in Europe. The biggest players in European natural philosophy. They admire the accomplishment of the Principia Mathematica, but its core doctrine, universal gravitation, is absurd. You know, Newton has, in a sense, hollowed out the world. Newton doesn't talk about the physical stuff of the world. He can't offer a material physical cause of universal gravitation. And so he's engaged, as far as most people are concerned, in a dereliction of scientific duty, which holds that the duty of science, the point of science, is precisely to explain phenomena in terms of their physical underpinnings. And you see, again, that connection with what he did to the ray of light. He hollowed out the ray of light in 1672, and now he's hollowed out the entire infinitely large universe. That there is, you know, as if you think back to what Andy was saying just now, you know, for Newton, all of the matter, and he says this, all of the matter in the infinitely large universe could be put in a peanut shell, because nearly everything is empty. The entire universe, all of you here, are basically empty. There's nothing there, according to Newton, or is there? These are the kind of things that Leibniz doesn't like. There he is. In response to criticisms from Leibniz, Newton produced a third rule of philosophizing in the second edition of Principia in 1713. This is an extremely important rule. It's his defense of induction, which is quite interesting. We can talk about that later. But he's moved from a sort of ultra-mathematicist kind of natural philosophy to one which is slightly more inductivist. The rule of philosophizing is about what's required to corroborate claims that you make inductively. And it was explicitly directed against Leibniz, and it contained the statement, again anti-Leibnizian, we are certainly not to relinquish the evidence of experiments for the sake of dreams and vain fictions of our own devising. I mean, Newton is now countering Leibniz's claim that the Newtonian philosophy is a fiction by now saying the entire Leibnizian philosophy is a fiction. And Newton defends with increasing virulence the idea that he himself does not feign hypotheses. And hypotheses non fingo becomes the cri de coeur of the Enlightenment. You know, we do not make hypotheses. What we do is based on mathematical certainty, empirical evidence, and hard work. That phrase comes from the second edition of Principia. And it's part of his attack on Leibnizian vortices and hypotheses in general. And I think in the last 3 years of Leibniz's life, he died in November 1716, we see this extraordinary battle, which I think is endemic within the way Newton thinks anyway, but a battle between these two giants of the period, about which one was pure fiction and which one was the truth. Months before the second edition appeared, in the summer of 1713, Newton had published the Commercium Epistolicum, a text-based documentary effort to show that he had developed fundamentals of calculus half a century earlier. So this is just a publication of letters and his own documents that proved that his work preceded Leibniz's in priority. And again, this is something I want to point to at the end. This is Newton's own propensity for litigation, that this is where he goes. Whenever proof is required, he displays himself to be, first of all, a brilliant documentarist, but also, I think, a conspiracy theorist of an extraordinary ability. This very substantial text, the Commerce of Letters, didn't convince Leibniz's followers. You have to understand that by this time, Leibniz's followers include Johann Bernoulli, Jakob Bernoulli, Daniel Bernoulli, Jakob Hermann, Leonhard Euler is just about round the corner. They have gone far beyond what Leibniz's followers have done by using Leibnizian notation and Leibnizian techniques. All of that is happening while this debate is going on, but Newton is focused on proving his own priority. Leibniz increasingly objected to Newton's documentarist approach and gradually came to see Newton as a kind of diabolical puppet master who incited his toadies to act in his defense, conniving in their actions. And there Leibniz is in a strong position until Queen Anne died on the 1st of August 1714, because Leibniz's own tutor and patron, not tutor, his patron, Georg Ludwig, became George I of England and comes over to England soon after he's made king. And with him he brings his niece, Princess Caroline, married to Georg's son, who will become George II in 1727. And Princess Caroline is a tutee of Leibniz. She is his favorite student. And she's going over into the heart of the enemy. And within days of her arriving, Newton and Samuel Clarke, Newton's lieutenant, are going round to her house, Kensington Palace, and they are saying, would you like to see some experiments on the void, and so on and so forth. We call it intellectual grooming. There's Newton at this time. Leibniz began a correspondence with Samuel Clarke, the most famous philosophical scientific correspondence of the 18th century, from 1715 to 16. And in the fourth letter, we see this big change in Leibniz's view. He becomes much more concerned, I think, about what he sees as underpinning this is what he knows to be the loss of his student to the enemy. But he becomes, I think he writes brilliantly about the dangers of the Newtonian philosophy. And his letters are full of the idea that Newtonianism is a fiction and a chimera, or rather a bundle of these things. In a codicil to a letter intended only for Caroline, Leibniz told her that he believed in the void, so this is a key Newtonian doctrine. He believed in the void when he was a kid, when he was a young man and not fully formed. It was a pleasing imagination, but the product of my own ignorance. Men imagined nature was as finite as their own mind, so atomists believed that nature was finite because they themselves are finite creatures, Leibniz said, but wrongly. The least corpuscle is actually subdivided in infinitum and contains a world of other creatures, which would be lacking if that corpuscle was an atom. To assert that the subdivision of nature stopped at the size of an atom was an arbitrary fiction, humans conceiving the world in their own image, which is exactly the claim Newton makes about his own enemies. At the bottom, you can see that Caroline received this letter on the 7th of May, 1716, and the next day she passed it on to Newton. That's Newton's writing at the bottom. So she's in the enemy camp. She's passing these private letters straight on to the head of the enemy. In the final letter that Leibniz wrote, he claimed that Newtonians peddled a superficial philosophy that forged things such as vacuous spaces and atoms. But his superior reasons, the superior reasons of metaphysics, did not allow them. The Newtonians' collective strange imagination made all matter gravitate to every other piece of matter. But what filled up empty Newtonian space? Was it full of spirits, like the sort of odd imaginations of the voodoo-wielding medievals? People were once again returning to the spectres of the imagination, he said, and to the perpetual miracle, or occult quality, or chimera of universal attraction, and ultimately to the kingdom of darkness, which is, of course, is the Christian reference to the realm of the devil. And he means that. He thinks Newton's stuff is diabolical. While Leibniz adored really good novels, like the science fiction written by Christian Huygens, irrational chimeras were becoming fashionable again in England. He said, no one would have published this rubbish in the early years of Charles II, i.e. before Newton came along. Oblivious to his own cultivation of acolytes, Newton claimed that Leibniz had created an army of disciples who were trying to dominate the Republic of Letters and populate it with his conceptual excrescences. Leibniz, at the end of his life, came to see Newton's doctrines as lying at the heart of a diabolical national cult with Newton as its head. Newtonianism, he said, was a false religion that had acquired illegitimate power through its proximity to the new sovereign. Newton's toadies did his bidding, and its core doctrines were a matrix of incoherent fictions. This is Newton's response, because we don't have time, but at the top, I don't know if you can see at the top there, it reads, Leibniz, and there's hundreds of these kinds of things in Newton's writings. This is all available online, Cambridge University Digital Library. You can search it through the Newton Project. This is Newton's id. This is what he thinks. Leibniz commends experimental philosophy, but adds that when experiments are wanting, it is allowed to imagine hypotheses and expect that until new experiments shall determine which of them are true. And upon this account, he thinks his philosophy may be justified, but he should consider that hypotheses are nothing more than imaginations, conjectures, and suspicions. And that is Newton's response. We can see that this is a battleground of accusations of fiction and romances. And by the way, Newton does not like romances or fictions. He hates fiction. He's got no serious books on fiction were found in his library. He's scared of them. He's scared of them. Right, the last two pages. Historians, we want to understand why Newton did what he did, and ultimately, obviously, we think this is partly due to Newton himself. It's his view of the world, the way he was brought up, his own psychopathologies. But historians rightly find psychologizing or appeals to psychology unhelpful, or they fall short of what's required in terms of an explanation. And they try and look at how individuals are shaped by and interact with their contexts. What structured Newton's or governed Newton's attitude to Feuds? Partly these are mental structures and partly social structures. And the latter, of course, the social structures that surround Newton are not static. Newton himself is influencing those structures. He gets power. He gets the authority to transform the world in his image. Newton professed deep hostility to metaphysics, to the public sphere, and to disputes about intellectual property. He keeps telling people he hates disputes. These brought disgrace and legal discourse into philosophy. It turned philosophy into a litigious lady. And Newton's always key that natural philosophy is not a forensic space. It's not about rhetoric. It's not about how clever you are and how well you argue. It's about the truth. Yet Newton's own actions, I think this is key. Newton writes about feuding all the time. He's deeply concerned about feuding. Newton's own actions were, I think, made inevitable the very kinds of feuds that he himself professed to despise. For example, keeping his work private. I mean, how else is one going to show that one has priority? How else is one going to influence the public sphere unless you publish things. But Newton has a very, very different, elite aristocratic way of thinking about the significance of his own work. And I think also as a basis for this, and we see this in the battles over romances and fictions, Newton is deeply hostile to fiction. It is undoubtedly related to what we know to be a kind of Calvinist element in his own religious thinking. He's a deeply devout religious man. In Calvinism, the godly are told that the mind is a dungeon. The hand makes what the mind conceives, and you get idolatry because human beings are hardwired to mistake the products of their own minds and hands for what really exists outside in the real world. The products, what is divine creation? That is who we are within Calvinism. We're sunken, fallen, depraved creatures who always mistake our own hypotheses and theories and productions for what's really the case. His anti-hypotheticalism, which underpins his critiques of Hooke and Leibniz, is closely related to his attacks and I think his fear of the power of the imagination in human beings in private. This personal attitude shows itself in a broader cultural form. In his attacks on hypotheses non fingo, I, Isaac Newton, do not feign hypotheses. I'm not prey to mistake the products of my own mind for what's really out there. That's what that means. In a more sort of grander sociological, social form, Newton transformed the world around him into a space where he could perhaps counter the work, the machinations of people like Hooke and Leibniz, who created armies of disciples to invade his own territory. In these battles, Newton had to marshal powerful groups, like his friend Lord Halifax, the Chancellor of the Exchequer, who made him the head of the Mint, like the King, who personally vouched for Newtonianism, like Princess Caroline. All these people are enrolled as allies into Newton's world, and they are a necessary condition for Newton triumphing, as he did briefly. Newton had to enroll these allies and did so. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. So, as the first question, the first person I saw actually was a gentleman in the penultimate row, red shirt.
Hi, a couple of questions about Hooke. You said he accused Newton of plagiarism for micrographia. What was that specifically? And also his rival society to the Royal Society, how many people joined that? What happened with it? Because he then went back to the Royal Society, obviously.
Yeah, I mean, the answer to the first one is a complex one. It is complicated, but essentially there are basic claims about the way nature is. I can't go into any more detail than that because it would take a couple of hours. The issue between them, I think, is very interesting, which is, if you look at Newton's response to it, it is about whether they're similar or dissimilar. So that the rhetorical form of argument is that in order to show plagiarism, you have to show that someone's work is similar to your own, or not dissimilar. And so most of the intellectual work that Newton is doing is to show, first of all, that Hooke's work is very different from his own, and then to show that Hooke's work is very similar to Descartes, because he wants to show that Hooke is a plagiarist, and he wants to show that he is not a plagiarist. With regard to your second question, the thing died after a couple of sessions. I think that Hooke got this out of his system. They had the first meeting where he said Newton was a plagiarist. It's in Hooke's diary, so you can actually see Hooke's own account of what they discussed in that first meeting. And it is about the wave versus particle theory of light. It's about some of the experiments that you find in micrographia, which Newton has, of course, built on in his own optical work. He's built on it, but he hasn't plagiarized.
How many were part of that?
Sorry?
How many were part of that?
What, the group?
The Rival Society, yeah.
I think only about 6 or 7. I mean, they're his mates, but they include Christopher Wren.
Was there a tension between Newton's hostility to the public sphere and the philosophy of the Royal Society, which depended on experiments, etc., being witnessed by other people?
Yeah, I think that there's a big tension. I think Newton can't handle being part of that group. You're absolutely right that the philosophy in that space of the Royal Society depends on the very things that he detests. I think he can't suffer being there for very long. That they require degrees of what in the jargon is called in-principle replicability. So that they demand that somebody write in a way that makes it easy for people to either see how things could be reproduced, replicated, or to be able to actually reproduce, replicate them themselves. And that requires describing things in a particular way, like Robert Boyle, where there's a virtue of tedium. Boyle has people draw images of real air pumps, of real experiments, things that actually existed. So this is the Aristotle. So this is this world. Boyle is an Aristotelian in that sense. This is this world. This is what actually happened. Newton's not. Newton's accounts of his experiments are diagrammatic and idealized, and people cannot reproduce them. That's part of his problem. And he's not about to write things tediously, as he says. He's not going to do the tedious line, because that's not proper natural philosophy. He wants absolute certainty, and you don't get that from having hundreds or thousands of people warranting what you've done by reproducing it. There's something inherent to the argument that you either get or you don't get. And if you don't get it, if you don't agree with Newton, you are essentially saying, the line from Newton is you're saying that I'm a liar, or you're saying that I'm incompetent. So go for it. Which one is it?
And yet Newton became the president of the Royal Society?
He did. But the Newton's presidency in the Royal Society is from 1703 to 27, in which, by the way, he supervises a number of extraordinary experiments from Francis Hawksby and others on hydrostatics and so on. But the sort of predilection for mathematicism in that moment is a sort of brief point in an unbroken, sort of medicalized, empiricist approach to British science that goes from 1660 to 1820. There are periodically efforts to overturn what people take to be bad natural history as the foundation of natural philosophy. But you've got somebody like Joseph Banks, who's president from 1778 to 1820. And Banks's view of the world dominates British natural philosophy for that period, for over 40 years. So the sort of mathematicist view doesn't come in until the 1820s and 30s into the Royal Society. But there are other avenues where people can do science in Britain.
One last quick question. Yes, gentleman in the third row from the back.
You've noted that in some way the Newton could have, ameliorated some of the problems with regard to plagiarism if he had immersed himself, if he published, then it would have helped to demonstrate priority. But the wider question, I suppose, about the vitriol, the ad hominem arguments and so on, was there anything that could have been done there, do you think, or was it inevitable given the personalities of the men concerned?
There's no one to rein him in. I think that's a problem. He became extremely powerful very, very quickly. And when he doesn't get his way, he takes his toys home and does his thing. Obviously, it's a fascinating question as to whether things could have been different. And you can see at the start of 1676, Henry Oldenburg does a great job of getting him to write this letter to Hooke, which is just a brilliantly done letter, which looks in one or two sentences like he's being genuinely paying homage to Hooke, and then in others he's saying, I've seen further than you. What you do is deeply problematic. And then, of course, Halley deals with some of this in the summer of 1686 and manages conversation in London to Hooke's disadvantage, because he's dealing with a very sensitive man who has had enough of Robert Hooke. And there's a wonderful letter that he writes to Halley. It's an addendum to a letter in June 1686, where he goes, to use a phrase, he goes off on one about Hooke and lists all of the slights that Hooke has done over many years. And it starts off, "Is this not very fine?" ? And he just goes through and destroys any claims Hooke has got. But that's how intellectual property disputes go. He was prepared to give Hooke some credit, but now he goes through the Principia and crosses out Hooke's name, because that's what happens. You upset me. I'm now going to take you out. That guy's not going to change. He's still an angry young man when he's 83.
Great. Thank you very much indeed. Thank Professor Iliffe.